Let's take a look at changing the show page for our color system over to be object-oriented now as well. Here at my index page in the browser, if I click on one of my colors, that should take me over to my show page. Right now my show page is not working at all because I have destroyed my color library file. Back when I worked on my index page, we cleaned all the functions out of it and deleted the file itself. So now whenever I try to go to the show page, we're just not getting anything at all. What the show page itself is trying to do is it's trying to load that color library file. Well, we don't need to do that anymore since there is no more color library file. I can just delete that. What the show page then goes on and does is it creates a selected color variable. It checks to make sure that the page was passed an ID as a get parameter. If it was not passed an ID as a get parameter, then what we're doing is redirecting the user back to the index page and exiting. If we do get an ID color, then we were loading all of our colors using our old load color function. We were retrieving our selected color from the array of colors that we got back from that function. We were generating the color code using our color code for function, which no longer exists. All of that data then was being used over in my actual show.view.php file, where we displayed the code inside a div. I guess actually technically looking at it, that is a span. We showed the color's name, we showed the code again in a paragraph, and we used the ID a couple of times in some hyperlinks we put together. Here's how I'd basically like to restructure this file. For starters, we're going to need to have access to our color class. So let me do a require for ../lib/color.php, which is where I have my color file actually stored, up one directory and then over in a separate directory called lib. Once I actually have that loaded, let me go ahead and get the busy work of making sure that we have an ID to work with out of the way. I'm going to say if, or even better, how about I just take the if statement I already have down there, I'm going to cut it, so I'll say if we have an ID, then we want everything to go on like normal. I think I'm going to change that a little bit though and say if we don't have an ID. And if we don't have an ID, then I'm going to go ahead and redirect the user to the index page and exit, so we can just effectively be done with that part of the logic. Just get it out of the way and not worry about it at all. So if we make it past that if statement, then at that point we know that we actually have a color. What I'd like to do there is instead of loading all of my colors, or at least as explicitly as I was here, I think what I'd like to do instead is I'd like to be able to just ask for one particular color. I'm thinking maybe something along the lines of, what if I said color find, and I were to pass the find function the ID of the color that I actually want. That would then let me get rid of pulling out the selected color from an array of all colors. The colors already know how to generate their own color code, so both of those two things could go away. I think that would leave me then just with a color object that I could make use of. In order for that to work, I need to define a find function for my color class. Over in my color class right now, I already have a static all function, which is just fine, but I would now also like to have a static find function. So let me go ahead and put in public static function find. I'll say the find function is going to be passed an ID, and I want that function to then get the proper color for me and return it. That could mean that I could have my find function go through and load all of my colors again, but since I already have my all function to read in all my colors from my file, how about I actually just use it? I could check to see if the colors had already been loaded, and then if they hadn't, I could call the all function, but we had already basically built that ability into the all function, where it can just be called whenever, and if it has already been called, it won't bother reading from the file again. It'll just give back the colors that we already have. So let me say self all, that'll return all of the colors. And then my find function just needs to return the one with the proper ID. I could say return from the colors the one that is at the index number that matches the ID. I think that would basically be the idea. I suppose the only potential problem there might be, what if we're past a bad ID? What if we're past an ID and a color doesn't exactly exist for that ID? Well, let's come back and look at that here in a second. For the moment, hopefully that will give us back a color. In my actual HTML then, my show.view.php file that generates the HTML, that should then mean I could say for the color, give me the code. For the color, show me its name. Again, we'll need the color's code here. And then in these two places where I need to use the color's ID, I can just access the ID as an object attribute. something like this. Let me see how my color page works in the browser, or my show page works in the browser at that point. Almost. The actual color itself doesn't seem to be showing up. If I click on a color, we're taken to the page, it's showing the right colors. I'm not actually seeing the color itself. Oh, that's what the problem was. Code for my colors is a function, so I need some parentheses on there. I'll put the parentheses there, put the parentheses there. There we go. Now the code itself is showing up and the actual color properly like it should. Click on any of my colors and I can see them, so we're back to having our working show page again. So overall that looks pretty good. There was that one small unresolved problem of what happens if we request a color with an invalid ID. Well, let's try it in the browser and see what happens. If I come over to my browser, I can see up in my address bar right now that this color is ID 6. I wonder if I have a color that has an ID of 999. If I try it, I'm not seeing anything at all. What's happening here, 999 is being passed over to our find function. The find function loads all the colors and tries to return a color with that ID, but there's nothing there. So essentially it's returning a nothing. It's returning a void, an empty. So we're ending up with no actual data that we can show on this page itself. How do you suppose we should handle that? Well, what if we did something along the lines of saying if is set a color with that ID. If a color of that ID actually exists, we'll go ahead and return it. On the other hand, if a color of that ID doesn't exist, then maybe we will just return false instead. False would be something that would be easy enough to detect to be able to figure out if there is no color of that particular type. If we do return false, then back over in the show page, we would be able to detect that here. If we wanted to detect it, we could say something like, if not color. If color is an object that's returned, it would be considered true. The not would make it false, and we would not execute this if statement. But if color doesn't exist, false will be returned. False is what we'll have there. The not will make it true, and we will execute the if statement. If we do execute the if statement, then that's basically an error condition. So at that point, what I could do is I could redirect the user to the index page and exit, effectively stop executing this script. Well, that's pretty much the exact same thing I had up here, isn't it? Do I really want to have that in there twice? Well, what would happen if we got rid of this top one? This top one effectively executes if no ID exists, if this page isn't given an ID. Well, if this page isn't given an ID, redirect to the index page. If it is given an ID, try to get the color, but if the ID is bad, redirect to the index page. It would be nice if we could combine those two together. What if I just got rid of that first test? What if I just assumed, try and get something called an ID and then find the color based on it? If I don't actually have an ID, then wouldn't that end up returning false for my color, in which case we redirect them back to the index page anyway? Effectively saying something like having no ID is the same as having a bad ID is what I'm thinking. Let's try it in the browser and see how that behaves. In the browser, if I go back to my index page, if I click on a color with a good ID, I see that color. If I manually put in a bad ID, I get redirected back to the index page. So a bad ID takes me to the index page. What happens if I go to the show page and I have no ID? It also sends me back to the index page. What happens is if there's no ID, then no ID gets passed to the find function. Since the find function doesn't have an ID to find a color with, it returns false. And the false ends up redirecting us back to the index page the same way as would happen if the ID we were given was invalid. So we have our working show page at this point. All too easy.